Okay, I wanted to go ahead and do a review regarding monetary policy and fiscal policy, the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. The most important pieces that I want you to know is that the Federal Reserve is basically trying to keep when I talk about this, the real GDP. So if we think about real domestic product, it normally looks something like this, right? Not necessarily, but there'll be highs and lows. The government doesn't want this. What they want is they've got three macro goals. They want to have low unemployment, steady growth, and stable prices. And to do that, they can either use monetary policy or fiscal policy. Because what we want to do is you want to smooth this out. You know, they want steady growth. And generally, according to the book, real GDP has grown at a rate of 3% over the last couple of years. All right, so in order to do that, we can implement what we call monetary policy and fiscal policy to achieve our macro goals. We use the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model to make predictions. So if I assume that an economy is in a recession, and the way I'll know that is I'll have real GDP on this axis, real gross domestic product. On this axis, I'll have the price level. Price level is nothing more than inflation. The long run aggregate supply curve, we said earlier, was vertical, and that's simply because this is what our production would be at what we call full unemployment. Remember, full unemployment is not necessarily 0% unemployment. That is just where our unemployment is equal to our natural rate plus our frictional rate. We have our short run aggregate supply curve, which is upward sloping. We said it was upward sloping specifically because it takes time for prices to adjust. And we have our aggregate demand curve, right, which is downward sloping. So let's say, for example, in this economy, and I'm going to do very simple, let's say this economy can produce 17 units of something. Currently, we're producing 10. So between here, this is what we would call our gap. We are what we would say, because we are currently producing less than our potential, we are in a recessionary gap. If we are in a recessionary gap, we want to expand the economy. We can expand the economy either using monetary policy or fiscal policy. So monetary policy would be things that the Federal Reserve does. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, would be what Congress does. And so with both of them, you can either expand the economy or contract the economy. So let's say monetary policy. If I want to expand the economy as far as monetary policy is concerned, I have a list of things I can do. Same thing with fiscal. Here, I'm in a recessionary gap. Therefore, I want to focus on expanding the economy, all right? I want to have easy policy, or I can contract. So some of the things that I can do as far as the Federal Reserve is concerned, they could manipulate the required reserve ratios. If they lower the required reserve ratios, and remember the required reserve ratios, nothing more than how much money gets locked up at the Federal Reserve every night. If they lower the required reserve ratios, that means there's more money available for loans. They can also lower the discount rate. Right? Remember, the discount rate is nothing more than what banks loan to the Federal Reserve loans to banks overnight, or they can buy bonds. So therefore, contractionary policy would be increase required reserve ratio, increase the discount rate, and sell bonds. All right? This is monetary policy. It has to do with the money supply. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, this is Congress. What Congress can do, if we are in a recession, we can increase government spending. Because remember, the aggregate demand curve was equal to C plus I plus G plus EX minus IM, all right, or net exports. So if we increase G right here on this side, then that means the right side goes up as well. We could decrease government spending if we wanted to contract the economy. This would happen if we had been, instead of being in a recessionary gap, we were in an inflationary gap, if these curves were located on this side. All right, the other thing that I can do, or they can do, they can lower taxes. When they lower taxes, then people have more available money. When they have more money, they can spend it in consumption, so aggregate demand is going to shift up. Opposite is they can raise taxes, or transfers. Transfers, again, when government gives somebody money, they can increase transfers, all right? That's capital T, or lower transfers, lowercase t. All right, so in this example I gave, we said there was a recessionary gap, so we want to focus on expansionary policy, all right? So I can either do something in this column or in this column. Let's assume that I'm going to focus on fiscal policy. So if the government wants to increase, let's say, government spending, we're going to increase G. If the government steps in, increases G right here, you would expect to see the aggregate demand go up, right? One of the things that we learned was that G will go up, but there's a multiplier effect that takes place. And that was where you needed to remember 1 over, you had to come up with a multiplier. It's going to be 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. All right, because when I give somebody $1, they're not going to spend that entire dollar. They're going to save a little bit, right? They're going to save, and so when they put that money in their pocket, then they're only going to let's say, for example, I give someone $1, and let's assume, let's play with some numbers here. Let's say somebody consumes 80% of what they make, all right? So 1 over 1 minus 0.8 is going to lead to 1 over 0.2, which gives me 5. So what that says is that for every dollar that is put into G, you can expect to see aggregate demand go up by not 1, but by up to 5. Same thing with investment here. So this is the multiplier. It applies to both investment and government. There's also a tax multiplier, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So for the 5, if I know my gap here, and I use the numbers 10 to 7, all right? So my gap is 7. I do not have to increase G by 7. In fact, if I increase G by 7, I'm going to see aggregate demand go up by 35, which means I'm going to overshoot my target and end up possibly way out here where I'm going to have, if this is assuming this is the price level, I could create inflation. Right? So instead, what I have to do is you have to take your gap, which is 7, you want to divide it by your multiplier, which is 5, and that's going to tell you how much you want to actually increase G by. All right, so of course, 7 divided by 5 is going to go 1 time. Point, we're going to have 1.4. So I need to increase G by 1.4 initially. And then over time, as that first cycle of money happens, it's going to increase the remainder here. And we could actually get aggregate demand to move out all the way out to here, putting us back in our long run equilibrium. Now this, of course, does not work if we have something called crowding out. The idea of crowding out would be, let me put it over here, if I have something crowding out. All right, let's assume the government's going to step in and do something that the private sector could do, perhaps supply laptops. If the government is supplying laptops, all right, and we're going to increase government spending up, what are businesses going to do? If the government goes out to spend money, and let's say the government goes and sells a bunch of bonds, and so the money supply is going to shrink. That could possibly cause interest rates to go up. If interest rates go up, we learned earlier that there's a link here between investment and interest rates, right? And that link, if I just mark that over here, the investment curve, that transmission process, investment is inversely related to the interest rate. All right, and what I'm trying to say there is when interest rates are low, people tend to borrow a lot of money, all right? When interest rates are high, people tend to borrow less money, all right? So here, if the government has stepped in, has borrowed a lot of money to provide these laptops, then it makes sense. Businesses are not going to be investing as much. That's true as long as this is. As long as investment is inversely related to interest rate, we want to make sure that it's not investment is interest rate sensitive. That's what that means here. If this is the case, then this will not happen. This transmission process doesn't happen. But let's assume that investment is downward sloping and not a vertical line. If that is the case, what will happen with crowding out is simply that whatever gains I would have had with an increase in G, there is going to be a little counter off with I, and that will depend. So the idea or concept of crowding out just occurs whenever the government increases spending, and we see this decrease in I.